The hand closed around his throat before he even heard footsteps. 1 second, Kalen Miro was reaching for a box of cereal on the bottom shelf. One hand stretched out, the other loosely holding the cart handle. The next second, his back slammed against cold metal shelving, glass bottles rattling violently behind his skull, and the air left his lungs like someone had pulled a plug. His feet barely touched the floor. "Did you really think?" Rydian Cade said quietly, the words coming through clenched teeth. "That I wouldn't find you?" The grocery aisle stretched long and bright under fluorescent lights. A woman 2 carts down saw what was happening. She looked away. A man near the end of the row pulled out his phone, not to call anyone, just to avoid eye contact. Kalen's fingers clawed at the wrist locked against his collarbone. 5 feet away, his twin boys, Aaron and Solon, stood completely still beside the cart. They weren't screaming yet. They'd learned not to make things worse. That was the detail that broke something open in Kalen's chest even while he was being choked. 5 years old, and they already knew how to shrink. Rydian leaned in close. The expensive cologne hit Kalen before the words did. Same cologne, same grip, same cold voice that used to make him apologize for things he never did. "You filed those papers without telling me. You moved without telling me. You took my sons." Kalen's vision was already going soft at the edges. "There," he forced the word out. "Mine." Rydian's grip tightened. That was the moment Aaron started crying. High and sharp and terrified, the way only a small child cries when they understand something is wrong but don't have words for it yet. Solon grabbed his brother's arm and pressed close, both of them trembling at the side of the cart, watching their father's feet lift slightly off the polished store floor. The aisle went cemetery quiet. Hi viewers, have you ever been in public and witnessed something wrong happening and felt that pull in your chest? That split-second choice between looking away or stepping in? Tell me in the comments what you would have done. Nobody moved. That's the truth about moments like this. Most people don't move. It's not cruelty. It's not even cowardice, not always. It's something older than both. The deep human instinct to stay out of other people's storms. But sometimes that instinct gets interrupted. Because at the far end of the aisle, past the cereal displays, past the frozen section glass doors reflecting white light, 3 men had stopped walking. They hadn't been looking for anything. Their convoy had pulled into the mall parking structure 20 minutes earlier because the youngest of their nephews had been screaming for ice cream since Tacoma, and none of the 3 brothers had been able to say no to a 6-year-old with that much conviction. One of the triplets turned his head. Then another. The third one was already watching. 3 identical faces. Same dark hair. Same jaw. Same stillness that wasn't peace, it was control. The kind of stillness expensive men develop when they've spent years being the most dangerous thing in every room they enter. Cadrix Valerius stood in the center. His eyes were not on Rydian. They were on Kalen. And something in his expression shifted, not much, not loudly, but the way a fault line shifts before anything on the surface knows the ground is moving. Solon broke first. The smaller twin let go of his brother's hand, took 3 running steps down the aisle, and grabbed the sleeve of the nearest dark suit. His small voice hit the silence like a stone dropped into still water. "Please help my papa." Cadrix looked down. Then he looked back up at Rydian, and the air in that grocery aisle changed completely. Therian Valerius was the one who moved first. Not fast, not loud, just forward. His shoes hit the tile in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like he had all the time in the world and every second of it belonged to him. Viral followed half a step behind. Cadrix didn't move yet. He stood still, watching Rydian with the kind of attention a man gives a problem he's already decided how to solve. Rydian turned. His grip on Kalen's collar loosened slightly, not from mercy, from instinct. 3 men walking toward you in identical black suits with identical expressions has a particular effect on the body, even before the brain catches up. "This is private," Rydian said. His voice came out steadier than it had any right to. Therion stopped 6 feet away. He didn't answer. He looked at the boys. Solon was still gripping the edge of his jacket sleeve, small fingers white-knuckled against the dark fabric. Therion looked down at that small hand, then back up. Something moved through his expression, quick and gone, like light passing through a crack. "Let him go," Therion said. Not loud, not sharp, just stated, like gravity, like a fact. Rydian let out a short laugh. "I don't know who you three think you are, but release him." That was Viral, standing to the left, arms loose at his sides. His voice hadn't risen either, but it had a different quality, the kind of quiet that doesn't leave room for argument. The kind of quiet that has history behind it. Rydian's jaw tightened. He was reading the room wrong. That was clear. He saw 3 men in suits and calculated wealth, competition, ego, the kinds of alphas he'd spent 15 years outmaneuvering in boardrooms. He'd done it with charm, with connections, with the particular skill of men who mistake reputation for power. But the people standing around them knew something he didn't. The woman who'd looked away was looking back now. But not at Rydian. She was watching the 3 brothers the way people watch something they cannot quite classify. A teenager near the end cap had gone completely still. The store manager, who had been walking down from the back with a tablet in hand, stopped moving. Because the Valerius name didn't just travel in corporate circles. It traveled in the kind of circles most people never wanted to enter. Courtrooms with sealed records. Buildings with no public listings. A certain waterfront property in Tacoma that nobody asked questions about. Rydian didn't know their names. That was his first mistake. The second was tightening his grip again. "Walk away," Rydian said, turning back to Kalen. "Before this becomes your problem." The alpha pheromones hit the aisle like a wall. Not aggressive, controlled, but layered in a way that had no natural equivalent. 3 apex-level outputs landing at once, ancient and commanding, stacking on top of each other until the air itself felt thicker. Rydian's hand loosened, not from choice, from biology. Even his body understood something his brain was still fighting. Kalen sagged against the shelf. He was gulping air in shallow, ragged pulls, both hands braced behind him on the metal shelving. His eyes moved between the 3 identical men, confused, half-conscious, trying to make sense of a situation his body had stopped cooperating with. Aaron ran to him, threw both arms around his father's waist and buried his face in his side. Solon, still standing near Therion, looked up. "Are you going to hurt him too?" the boy asked. Therion crouched down. Right there in the grocery aisle in a $3,000 suit. He went to one knee and looked at the 5-year-old directly. "No," he said. "Nobody is going to hurt him." Solon studied his face for a long moment, the way small children do, without filters, without politeness. And then he nodded once, like he'd made a decision. Then he held out his arms. And Therion picked him up. The shift in the room was immediate, because Rydian was watching now with different eyes. His gaze moved from Therion holding the child, to Viral stepping closer, to Kadrix, who had finally begun to walk forward with that same unhurried certainty that had not changed once since they'd entered the aisle. Rydian's face went through 3 different expressions in 4 seconds. Recognition hit last. Late. Too late. His face lost color. Because the tattoo on Kadrix's collarbone, partially visible where his shirt sat open at the top button, was not subtle if you knew what it meant. And Rydian, who had spent 15 years in the kind of financial networks that crossed into very gray territory, knew exactly what it meant. The Valerius crest. He had just put his hands on an omega in front of the 3 kings of the West Coast Mafia. Kadrix stopped directly in front of him and smiled. It was the most frightening thing Kalen had ever seen. Kadrix didn't touch Rydian. He didn't need to. He just stood there, close enough that Rydian had to choose between holding his ground or stepping back. And Rydian, who had never backed down from anything in his life, who had built his entire identity around never yielding, stepped back. One step, small, involuntary, but everyone in that aisle saw it. Kadrix turned away from him like the problem was already resolved, like Rydian had simply ceased to exist as anything worth tracking, and looked at Kalen. That was when it happened. It wasn't visible to anyone else. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sound to it, no flash of light, no movie-ready moment to signal that something significant had just occurred. It was just scent. Kalen's omega scent, which had been buried under fear and adrenaline, and the sharp antiseptic smell of the cleaning products on the shelf behind him, hit open air as his body finally exhaled properly for the first time in minutes. And Kadrix stopped breathing. Not dramatically, just paused. Like a man walking through a dark hallway who suddenly finds a door he wasn't looking for. Viral, 2 steps to his left, turned his head. Therian, still holding Solon against his chest with one arm, went very still. The 3 of them exchanged one look. Brief, wordless, but packed with something. Kalen, still trying to remember how to stand upright, completely missed. Some moments feel like accidents. Others feel like gravity. Like the universe has been tilting in one direction for years, and you only notice it when you're standing at the bottom of the slope. Kalen pressed one hand flat against the shelf to keep himself vertical. His throat ached in a specific, focused way that meant bruising was coming. His sons were both pressed against him now. Aaron still wrapped around his waist. Solon returned to his side after Therian gently set him down. "Are you injured?" Viral asked. The question came out measured. Clinical. But his eyes were not clinical. "I'm fine," Kalen said. Reflexive. The kind of fine that people say when they are absolutely not fine but have spent years training themselves to say it anyway. Viral's expression made it clear he understood exactly what that word meant. Mall security arrived from the south entrance. 2 guards moving quickly, hands already reaching for radios. They slowed when they saw the Valerius triplets. One of them made a small, involuntary sound. The other one stopped entirely and pulled the first one back a step. Rydian tried to reassemble himself. "This man attacked me," he said, addressing the guards, voice steady, pointing at no one in particular. "I want to press charges." Nobody in the aisle acknowledged him. That was somehow worse than being argued with. Kadrix was still watching Kalen. Not with hunger. Not with anything Kalen could name cleanly. More like verification. Like a man checking a map against a landmark, confirming something that had been theoretical until right now. "Can you walk?" Kadrix asked. "Yes." Another reflex. Kalen pushed off the shelf and proved it, staying upright by force of will alone. Kadrix nodded once. He did not offer a hand. He seemed to understand, from looking at Kalen for 40 seconds, that offering a hand would be the wrong move. That a man who had spent years being controlled would not reach for help from a stranger, no matter how badly he needed it. Respect that, or lose him. The mall security situation was handled in the background. Viral speaking low and quick to one of the guards, a card appearing from his jacket pocket, names being written down. Rydian attempted to re-enter the conversation twice. Both times he was redirected with the practiced efficiency of men who had been managing problems far larger than this for a very long time. By the time Kalen realized the situation had been contained, Rydian was being walked toward the security office by both guards, still talking, still insisting on something, his voice now doing a thing it never used to do, climbing in pitch, losing smoothness, panicking. Kalen watched him go. He didn't feel triumph. He felt tired. Bone level, deep in the marrow tired. The kind that comes not from a single bad afternoon but from years of afternoons like this one, stacked and compressed until they had their own weight. Aaron tugged his sleeve. "Papa, that man is staring at you." Kalen looked up. Kadrix had not moved. He was watching Kalen with that same unreadable expression. But there was something underneath it now. Something that didn't belong in a grocery aisle or a random afternoon or any situation that was supposed to be ordinary. We'd like to get your children somewhere safe, Kadric said, and have a doctor look at your throat. Kalen shook his head. I don't even know who you are. Kadrix looked at him for a moment. No, he said. You don't. He said it without apology and without explanation, and in a tone that meant the explanation would come. But on his schedule, not under pressure. Viral appeared at Kadrix's shoulder. The two of them exchanged that look again. Therian crouched down in front of the boys, producing 2 wrapped candies from his jacket pocket with the casual confidence of a man who had nephews and had learned to carry provisions. Both boys took them without hesitation. Children, Kalen thought distantly, had better instincts than adults in some situations. Or worse ones. He hadn't decided yet. Kadrix turned slightly and said something to one of the suited men who had materialized at the edge of the aisle. Security detail Kalen was only now registering as such. The man nodded and left. Kadrix turned back. There's a car outside, he said. We have a private medical suite. Your boys will be comfortable. I'm not getting in a car with strangers, Kalen said. That's a reasonable position. The agreement surprised Kalen enough that he forgot to respond. Kadrix reached into his jacket and produced a card. Simple. Black. 3 letters embossed in silver. He placed it on the cart handle rather than handing it directly. Call that number, he said. Ask anything you want. We'll wait. He stepped back. All 3 of them did, open space around Kalen in a way that was deliberate. No crowding. No pressure. Just the card sitting on the cart. And 3 men who had just dismantled one of the worst moments of Kalen's year, standing at a respectful distance, watching him with an intensity that had nothing possessive in it yet. Just recognition. Like they'd been waiting. Kalen picked up the card. Turned it over. Nothing on the back. He looked up. Take him to the penthouse, Kadrix said quietly. Not to Kalen. To his brothers. The ceiling was white. That was the first thing Kalen registered. Clean white with recessed lighting set low, the kind of light that was warm and deliberate and cost more to install than his monthly rent. The surface beneath him was soft in a way that real mattresses, not the foam slab kind, not the discount store kind, are soft. The kind of soft that comes from actual springs and actual materials and someone who cared about the difference. He sat up fast. Too fast. The room tilted and his hand shot out and grabbed the edge of the bed frame, and he sat there breathing for a moment, cataloging the room with the specific speed of a man who had woken up in bad situations before and learned to assess exits first, details second. No locks on the inside of the door. 1 large window, city lights beyond it. Seattle skyline, distant and jeweled, which meant he was high up. His sons. They're in the next room. Kalen spun. Viral sat in a chair in the corner. Not close, not hovering, just present. He had removed his jacket. His arms rested on the armrests in a posture that was deliberately non-aggressive, which Kalen noticed and did not fully trust. Both of them are asleep, Viral said. The door between the rooms is open. You can check. Kalen was already moving. He crossed to the connecting door, pushed it open, and stood in the threshold for a long moment looking at his boys. Aaron and Solon were curled together on a bed that was 3 times the size of the one they shared at home, both of them breathing slow and even, still wearing their shoes because no one had wanted to wake them. Someone had covered them with a blanket. That detail hit Kalen somewhere unexpected. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, looking at his sleeping children, and didn't say anything. Then he went back. Viral hadn't moved. Kalen crossed his arms and stayed near the connecting door. How long was I out? About 2 hours. You passed out in the car. Viral paused. Your oxygen levels were low. There's bruising on your throat. The doctor has already seen you. You were conscious enough to answer basic questions, though you may not remember it. Kalen touched his neck. The soreness confirmed the rest. I want to leave, he said. I know. Then. Kadrix wants to speak with you first. Viral's voice was even. No pressure in it. If you want to leave after that, we'll take you wherever you need to go. Kalen studied him. The thing about Viral Valerius up close was that he was harder to read than his brothers. Kadrix moved with visible intention. Therian carried warmth on the surface, easy and deployed. With precision. But Viral was still. Deep water still. The kind of person who had learned to keep everything below the surface because the surface was where people got red. You're the protective one, Kalen said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. Viral looked at him with something that was almost surprise. The boys ran to Therian, Kalen continued, because he'd already said it and there was no point stopping. He was the one they trusted immediately. Kadrix was watching the situation. But you were the one watching the exits. A beat of silence. Yes, Viral said. Kalen nodded once. The door opened. Kadrix and Therian entered. Not together, with the staggered timing of people who had learned to enter rooms without crowding them. Kadrix carried nothing. Therian had 2 glasses of water and set one on the nightstand near Kalen without comment. Kalen didn't touch it. Kadrix stood near the window. Therian took the end of the bed. Perched on the corner of it, posture loose, the way he probably sat in every room he entered. Like he'd decided in advance that the tension level was going to stay manageable and was simply holding that intention in place. Why are you helping me? Kalen asked. He kept his voice level. No please. No softness. He had used please for years with someone who took it as weakness, and he was done offering softness to men he hadn't verified yet. Kadrix looked at him for a moment. That's a complicated answer, he said. Then give me the short one. Something in Kadrix's expression shifted. Not a smile, but adjacent to one. Like the directness had registered as something worth noting. Because someone with your profile should not have been in that situation unprotected, he said. My profile, Kalen repeated. You don't know anything about me. We know more than you'd expect. The air in the room shifted. Kalen's gaze moved between the 3 of them. That's supposed to be reassuring? He said. No, Therian said from the end of the bed. It's just true. Viral leaned forward slightly in his chair. Not aggressive. Just present in a way that meant he was about to say something he'd been holding since the aisle. Someone like you, he said quietly, should never have been left alone. The words landed wrong. Not wrong like incorrect. Wrong like they hit somewhere Kalen didn't have armor over. He kept his face even through it, but his hands tightened slightly on his own forearms where they were crossed. I'm not alone, he said. I have my sons. Yes, Viral agreed. And you've been protecting them by yourself with limited resources, while being pursued by a man with considerably more. He paused. That's not strength failing. That's math. Kalen looked at the ceiling for 1 second. Just one. Then back down. Why does it matter to you? He asked again. Different inflection this time. Not hostile. Genuinely asking. The 3 brothers looked at each other. That look again, the one from the aisle. Quick. Layered. Holding a conversation Kalen couldn't hear. Therian opened his mouth. Kadrix put a hand up. One gesture. Brief. Therian closed his mouth and looked at the window. Kadrix looked at Kalen. There are things we need to explain, he said carefully, that require context you don't have yet. And I'd rather earn the right to give you that context before I just hand it to you. That's not an answer. It's the most honest one I have right now. Kalen stared at him. He was not used to powerful men saying things like that. In his experience, powerful men filled space. They explained themselves loudly and completely, whether or not anyone asked, whether or not the explanation was real. They used words as architecture. Building something impressive that you were supposed to stand inside and be grateful for the shelter. Kadrix hadn't done any of that. The quiet bothered Kalen more than the talking would have. From the next room, Solin's voice floated through the open door. Small, sleepy, disoriented. Papa. Kalen moved before he'd finished deciding to, which was how he moved with his sons, always on instinct, immediate, the kind of responsiveness that doesn't wait for thought. He was through the door and beside the bed in 4 seconds. Solon blinked up at him with one eye, the other still pressed against the pillow. "Where are we?" the boy mumbled. "Somewhere safe," Kalen said. His voice surprised him. Came out certain. Not performed, actual. He smoothed Solon's hair back and waited until the boy's eyes closed again. Then he stayed crouched beside the bed for a moment, in the dark, with the city light coming through the gap in the curtains. Behind him, in the other room, he heard Therion say something low to his brothers. Then quiet. Then Therion's voice again. Softer. Meant to carry just far enough. "We believe you may belong to us." Kalen didn't go back into the room. Not immediately. He sat on the edge of his son's bed in the dark and let those words exist in the air for a full minute without touching them. The way you don't touch a hot surface until you're sure how hot it actually is. Belong to us. He had belonged to someone before. He knew exactly what that looked like. When he finally walked back through the connecting door, all 3 brothers were still present. Arranged in the same positions, like they hadn't moved, like they'd been comfortable waiting and didn't need him to know it. Kalen closed the door behind him softly. "Explain that," he said. Therion looked at Kadrix. Kadrix nodded once. Not permission exactly, more like acknowledgement. "Your turn." "There's a biological compatibility that exists in rare cases between an omega and a shared alpha lineage," Therion said. "Triplets with the same bloodline carry a linked bonding chemistry. The compatibility triggers on scent recognition. It's uncommon, clinically documented but almost never observed in real conditions, because the right person almost never appears." Kalen said nothing. "In the aisle," Therion continued, "when your scent hit open air, all 3 of us registered it at the same time. That doesn't happen by chance. That's specific." "You're saying," Kalen said slowly, "that I'm supposed to be with 3 men I met 40 minutes ago in a grocery store because of chemistry." "I'm saying the chemistry is real," Therion said. "What happens after that is a choice. Every step after this is your choice," Viral added. He wasn't looking at Kalen directly now. He was looking at the window, which somehow made it feel more sincere. "We're not telling you this to pressure you into anything." "Then why are you telling me?" "Because you deserve to have the truth," Kadrix said, "and make your own decisions with actual information, which is apparently not something you've been given very often." That last line landed flat and honest and too accurate to deflect. Kalen sat down on the edge of the chair near the door, not fully in the chair, ready to stand if he needed to, and looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. "I need you to understand something," he said, "before any of this goes further. Whatever this is." His voice was even, controlled. "I had someone tell me he was protecting me for 6 years. He told me his family came first. He told me his feelings were real. And every one of those things was true right up until it wasn't. And by the time I understood what I was living inside, I had 2 children and no money and no contacts and nowhere to go except the one place he couldn't follow me to legally. Nobody spoke. He didn't hit me every day," Kalen continued. "That's the part nobody believes because people expect it to be constant. It wasn't constant. It was a pattern. He'd pull back and it would be good for a while. Long enough to make me think I'd imagine the bad parts. Then something would shift and the control would come back, and it would be worse than the last time. Abusers don't always use fists. Sometimes they use reputation, money, the careful architecture of isolation, the way you don't notice a wall being built until you're already inside it. He isolated me from everyone I knew," Kalen said. "Slowly, consistently. He made me feel like I was a problem he was managing. And when I finally got out, when I finally had the paperwork and the court dates and all of it, he started in on the custody angle. Because he knew that was the one thing that could still move me. Solon's face last night in the parking lot. Aaron's silence in the grocery aisle. They've seen too much, Kalen said. They know how to be quiet around danger. My 5-year-olds know how to read a room. He stopped. There was a pressure behind his eyes that he refused to give ground to. Kadrix was watching him with that focused, specific attention again, the kind that didn't try to fill the silence with comfort or redirect the discomfort away. He just let Kalen's words exist in the room without immediately trying to fix them. That was unexpected. Ridian Cade, Kadrix said after a moment. Yes. He has legal access to the children currently? Supervised visitation. My attorney fought for the supervised part. He's been trying to remove the supervision requirement for the last 8 months. Viral uncrossed his arms. On what grounds? On the grounds that he's a well-connected alpha with money and a very good lawyer and a narrative that frames me as unstable. Kalen's jaw tightened. He told our judge that I had emotional regulation issues, that my perception of events was distorted. He paused. The judge asked me to provide witnesses to the abuse. I didn't have any, because he was very good at making sure there were never witnesses. Therian's expression had gone very quiet. There are always traces, Viral said. The financial kind, Kadrix confirmed. Both of them said it almost simultaneously, not quite in sync, slightly off, like they'd had some version of this thought pattern so many times it had become automatic. Kalen looked between them. What does that mean? Kadrix stood. He moved to the desk near the window. There was a slim laptop open there that Kalen hadn't noticed before, and typed something with the focused economy of a man who kept his movements precise. He turned the screen. Kalen leaned forward. It was a financial document. Several pages, dense with figures, account numbers, company names. Some of the names were familiar, peripheral things he'd caught edges of during the marriage. A consulting firm, a holding company, an investment vehicle that Ridian had explained once and then never mentioned again. This is Ridian's money? Kalen asked. Part of it, Kadrix said. Where did this come from? We have access to certain financial networks that aren't public. He paused. What you're looking at is 18 months of transaction history across 4 shell companies. All of them tied to a primary account held in a name that isn't Ridian's but that maps to an LLC he controls. Kalen straightened. His throat was dry. What is he laundering? He asked. The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that means nobody knows the answer. The kind that means the answer is worse than the question. Kadrix looked at him steadily. That, he said, is still being confirmed. He turned the laptop back, opened a second file. A name appeared at the top of the document, a federal investigation number beneath it, and below that a list of associated parties. And there, third from the bottom, in clean black text on a white screen, was a name Kalen recognized. Not Ridian's name, a name that connected to Ridian, a name that connected to money, a name that connected, through 2 degrees of financial separation, to something Kalen couldn't fully process yet. He sat back in the chair. His hands were steady. His mind was not. He's been building a case against me for custody, Kalen said slowly, while this has been sitting in the background. Yes, Kadrix said. If this surfaces. It will surface, Viral said. Not a threat. A statement. Kalen looked at the screen one more time. Then he looked at Kadrix. You found this in one afternoon, he said. We were looking, Kadrix said simply. The meaning landed quietly. They'd started looking the moment they saw him in the aisle. Before they knew anything about him. Before they knew his history or his sons or his case. They had started looking. Kalen pressed both hands flat on his knees. Outside the window, the Seattle skyline sat in patient darkness. Lights strung across the water. The whole enormous, indifferent city breathing without knowing what was happening in this room. What is Ridian connected to? Kalen asked again. Kadrix met his eyes. And this time he answered. Which moment hit you hardest in these 5 chapters? Was it the twins staying silent because they'd learned to, Kalen describing the pattern of abuse, or Therian picking up Solon in that aisle? Drop your answer in the comments. Your response might shape what comes next. The article dropped at 6:47 in the morning. Kalen saw it on his phone before he was fully awake. The notification came through a Google alert he'd set up on his own name 2 years ago, after Ridian had started making moves he couldn't track through normal channels. The headline read, Omega Father at Center of Valerius Controversy, Sources Allege Manipulation. He sat up. Read it once. Then again. The article didn't use his full name. It used his initials and enough identifying details. Twin boys, Seattle, recent divorce from a prominent business alpha, that anyone who knew him would know exactly who it was. The framing was precise, calculated. Ridian hadn't written it himself. He was smarter than that. He'd fed it to someone, shaped the language from a distance, kept his fingerprints off the construction while putting his architecture all over the content. The core claim was this: a vulnerable Omega, recently separated from a stable home environment, had made contact with the Valerius organization through unclear circumstances. Questions were being raised about the nature of that contact, about whether the children were in an appropriate environment, about whether protective services should be involved. Kalen stared at that last line for a long time. Protective services. That was the move. Not a direct custody filing. Not a confrontation. Ridian was too smart for direct confrontation now that the Valerius name was attached. So instead he'd built a story, quiet, civilian-facing, written in the language of concern, that cast Kalen as the problem. That's how it always worked. Not an attack. A question. Questions are harder to fight than accusations because they don't require proof. They just require repetition. Kalen set the phone face down on the mattress. His boys were still asleep. He had about 40 minutes before that changed. He stood, crossed to the window, and looked at the city. Seattle in early morning carried a specific gray that wasn't quite fog and wasn't quite cloud. Just a diffuse low light that made everything look provisional, like the day hadn't committed to itself yet. The door knocked twice. He opened it. Kadrix was already dressed. Fully. Jacket, shirt, the complete architecture of a man who either hadn't slept or had slept 4 hours and decided that was sufficient. He held up his phone. The same article was open on his screen. I saw it, Kalen said. Kadrix nodded. He didn't say anything else for a moment. Just stood in the doorway, and Kalen had the impression he was measuring something. Not Kalen's reaction. The situation. Running calculations behind those controlled eyes. He filed a custody modification request this morning, Kadrix said. Time-stamped 40 minutes before the article posted. Kalen's jaw tightened. Coordinated, he said. Yes. He planned this before yesterday. The modification request was drafted 3 days ago, Kadrix said. The attorney who filed it has a history with a specific family court judge. They have lunch together twice a month. Pause on that. A judge. A shared lunch schedule. A custody filing drafted before Ridian even confronted Kalen in that aisle. This wasn't a reaction. This was a sequence. Ridian had known where Kalen shopped, had known his schedule, had confronted him publicly, deliberately, where there would be witnesses who could later say Kalen was seen with a mafia-connected organization, and then had used that public confrontation as the first frame in a media narrative about instability and poor judgment. The grocery aisle hadn't been rage. It had been set up. Kalen pressed one hand against the window glass. Cold. Solid. He focused on that for exactly 3 seconds, then let go. My lawyer, he said. I need to call her. Already done, Kadrix said. Viral reached her at 6 this morning. She's aware of the modification filing and the article. She's pulling the prior custody agreement now. Kalen turned. You called my lawyer. Viral did. With your attorney's publicly listed emergency contact number. Kadrix held his gaze. You can be angry about it. I am. That's fair. The thing was, it should have felt like control. It had the shape of control. Someone else making calls, arranging things, moving pieces without asking. That was the pattern Kalen had lived inside for 6 years, and his body recognized the shape of it even when the content was different. But Kadrix wasn't pretending it hadn't happened. He wasn't explaining it into something more palatable. He said, you can be angry, and then waited. Kalen exhaled slowly. Don't do that again without asking, he said. Understood. I mean it. I know you do, Kadrix said. And I won't. From the next room, Aaron's voice came through the door, morning groggy, asking for cereal with the specificity only a 5-year-old at full wake-up can manage. Kalen almost smiled. Almost. The article will spread, Kalen said. Yes. People will believe it. Some will. And the custody hearing is in 4 days, Kadrix said. Which means we have 4 days. Kalen looked at him. 4 days to do what? Kadrix's expression did something complicated. To make sure Rydian walks into that courtroom with less ground than he thinks he has. It sounded clean and controlled and entirely manageable when he said it like that. But Kalen had learned. The hard way, the extended way, the 2-year divorce way, that things that sounded clean and controlled had a habit of coming apart in the specific moments that mattered most. He's going to say I'm unstable, Kalen said. He's going to say my judgment is compromised because I came here with you. He's going to use this building, this address, your names, all of it, as evidence that I put my children in an inappropriate environment. Yes, Kadrix said. And you're not worried about that. I'm very worried about that, Kadrix said. But worried and unprepared are 2 different things. Therian appeared behind him in the hallway, carrying 2 small plates with toast. The kind of thing you make when children are about to wake up and you want to have something ready. He caught Kalen's eye through the doorway and raised his eyebrows slightly. Okay? Kalen looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. Come in, he said. The 3 of them entered. And Kalen sat down at the table near the window with his arms crossed, looking at 3 men who had, in the span of 1 night, contacted his attorney, sourced a federal financial document, and made his children toast. His phone buzzed. He turned it over. A text from a number he didn't recognize. For words. Drop them. Or else. Kalen looked up. All 3 brothers were already watching him. He turned the phone around. Therian asked Kalen a question then. Quiet, unhurried, like he'd been thinking about whether to ask it for an hour. If we destroy him, will you still be afraid? Kalen didn't look away. He answered honestly. Yes. For days was not enough time. And it was too much time. That was the contradiction Kalen lived inside for the next 72 hours. Too many hours to stop thinking. Not enough hours to stop being afraid. The penthouse had a routine now. That was the part that caught him off guard. Not the security detail that changed shifts at 6 and midnight. Not the encrypted phones or the low conversations behind closed doors or the occasional visitor who arrived and departed without being introduced. Those things Kalen filed away as background, the machinery of a world he was temporarily adjacent to without belonging to. The routine was the other thing. Breakfast at 7:30, because that was when the boys woke up. Solon needed 15 minutes before he was ready to talk to anyone. He'd always been that way, quiet in the mornings, needing his own time to surface. Aaron was the opposite. Aaron hit consciousness talking. Therian had figured both of those things out by the second morning without being told. He stopped trying to engage Solon before the boy finished his juice. He met Aaron's immediate morning conversation with matching energy. Not forced, not performed, just present. Responsive. The way you have to be with a child who has decided they like you before you've had coffee. Kalen watched all of that from the kitchen doorway. Safety is strange when you've lived without it long enough. At first it feels like another trap, something positioned to look like shelter while the walls are still being built around you. You wait for the condition, the cost, the moment the warmth turns transactional. It hadn't turned yet. That was its own source of stress. On the second day, Viral sat with Kaylin in the study while the boys watched a movie in the other room. He spread out the legal documents, the custody agreement, the modification request, the supporting declarations Rydian's attorney had filed. He didn't explain everything. He asked Kaylin questions. Specific, precise questions about dates, locations, specific incidents. He wrote answers down by hand, not typed, written, in a narrow notebook with a blue pen. The handwriting was cramped and quick. Why handwritten? Kaylin asked. Habit, Viral said without looking up. Bad habit or good habit? Viral paused, looked up. Depends on who's asking. Kaylin almost smiled again. He was doing that more. The almost smile. Like the muscle existed but hadn't fully committed to function yet. On the third day, Kadrix found him on the terrace after the boys were asleep. Seattle at night from 40 floors up looked like a circuit board. Ordered chaos, everything connected, nothing still. Kaylin had his hands on the railing and his shoulders up near his ears, which was how he'd been holding himself for years without noticing, like he was always slightly braced for impact. Kadrix stood beside him without touching anything, just looked at the city. You're going to ask me something, Kaylin said. I was going to stand here quietly. You've been working up to something since this morning. A pause. Yes, Kadrix admitted. Then ask. Kadrix turned slightly. He studied the side of Kaylin's face the way he'd studied the grocery aisle, not with hunger, with attention. The kind of attention that is a form of respect when someone applies it carefully. What did you want? He said. Before him. Not what happened during the marriage. Not how bad did it get. Not what do you need now. Before him. Kaylin's hands loosened on the railing. He thought about it for a real moment. Not the performance of thinking, actually going back. Before Rydian. Before the wedding. Before the relationship had revealed its real structure. I wanted to design things, he said finally. Spaces. Architecture. I was 2 years into a program when we met. He paused. He said the degree was a hobby, that it was sweet. He said it like a compliment, and I didn't hear what he was actually doing until much later. Kadrix said nothing. I wanted my boys to have a yard, Kaylin continued. Not sure why he kept going. But something about the city and the dark and the fact that nobody was asking him to stop made the words keep coming. Not a big one. Just grass. Something they could run across without shoes on. He stopped, looked at his hands on the railing. That's not much, he said. It's everything, Kadrix said. Kaylin turned to look at him. The expression on Kadrix's face was unguarded. For the first time since the aisle. The calculation was still there, because it probably lived permanently behind his eyes, but it had stepped back enough that something underneath showed through. Something that was not control. Something that was not authority. Just a man. Looking at another person. With the specific attention of someone who had been looking for a long time and had stopped expecting to find anything. You said you'd explain, Kaylin said quietly. The compatibility. What it means. What you expect. I don't expect anything, Kadrix said immediately. Then what do you want? The city breathed below them. Kadrix exhaled. And then he said the thing he'd been holding since that aisle. Since that moment when Kaylin sent hit open air and something in Kadrix's chest had recognized it the way you recognize your own name in a crowded room. You are our destined Omega. He said it clean. No apology. No performance. No attempt to make it land softer than it was. Just the truth spoken plainly to a person who deserved to have it. Kaylin looked at him for a long moment. The wind off the water moved between them. That's a lot, Kaylin said. I know. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it right now, Kadrix said. We have a custody hearing in 18 hours. Everything else can wait. Kaylin nodded slowly. He turned back to the city. Kadrix stayed beside him. Neither of them spoke again for a while. But the silence between them was different from the silence that had started the conversation. Lighter, more honest. The kind of silence that two people share when something has been said that needed to be said and both of them are deciding what it changes. Inside, through the glass door, Kalen could see the faint blue light of the television still running. Therian had fallen asleep on the couch with Solon tucked against his side. The boy's small hand curled around the edge of his sleeve. Viral was at the dining table, still writing in that notebook. Kalen watched them through the glass for a moment. 3 men who had walked into his worst afternoon and stayed, and something in his chest shifted. Not open, not trusting, but leaning, just slightly, leaning towards something that didn't feel like danger. Not yet. Tomorrow was the courtroom, and Rydian was walking in confident. That was the part that wouldn't let Kalen sleep. Not the threat. He'd lived with Rydian's confidence for years, but the specific confidence of a man who had walked into a room having already prearranged the outcome. Rydian believed he had won before the hearing started. The question was why? What did he know? What had he arranged? What was waiting in that courtroom that none of them had seen yet? The courtroom smelled like paper and old wood and the specific institutional stillness of rooms where people's lives get decided by other people. Kalen sat at the respondent's table. His attorney, Marceline Dupree, sharp, precise, the kind of lawyer who wore reading glasses she didn't need because they made opposing counsel underestimate her, had her files arranged in a specific order that Kalen had learned to read over 18 months. Low stack on the left meant routine. High stack on the right meant she was loading for something. Today the right stack was high. That mattered. Across the aisle, Rydian sat with 2 attorneys and a demeanor that belonged to a man attending a meeting he expected to be brief. He'd worn a gray suit, soft gray, not dark, the color choice deliberate, approachable, reasonable, the visual language of a man who simply wanted to see his children. He hadn't looked at Kalen once since entering. That was also deliberate. The gallery behind the bar was not full. Custody modifications at this level didn't draw crowds. But Kalen was aware, without turning around, of exactly who was present. Viral and Therian were seated in the second row. Kadrix was not in the room. That had been the plan. Kadrix's name carried the heaviest weight publicly, and putting him in a family courtroom would give Rydian's attorney a visual to work with. So Kadrix had stayed outside, in a car, with his phone and a direct line to Marceline. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Judge Arlene Osei. 62, 28 years on the family court bench, the kind of judge who had heard every variation of every argument and had stopped being impressed by performance somewhere around year 9. She sat. Everyone sat. Rydian's lead attorney, a man named Burkett, silver-haired, practiced, stood immediately. He was good. Kalen had to give him that. The opening statement was clean and measured. It was about children's stability, about a father's concern, about a specific and documented series of decisions that raised questions about the respondent's judgment. He used the words concerning environment 4 times. He used the phrase exposure to criminal enterprise twice. He never said the Valerius name directly in the first 3 minutes. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room with a search history knew what he was referring to. Judge Osei's expression didn't change. She made one note. Then Marceline stood. Your Honor, the petitioner's filing is dated 3 days prior to the incident it references as its primary justification. She paused just long enough. The timeline is worth noting. Burkett objected. The judge waved it flat. Marceline opened the left stack. The hearing moved through its early procedural stages, declarations, responses, authentication of exhibits. Rydian's side introduced the newspaper article, 3 photographs taken outside the penthouse building, and a signed declaration from a person Kalen had never heard of claiming to have witnessed Kalen behaving erratically in a public space 6 months prior. Kalen had never met this person. He wrote the name on a notepad and slid it to Marcel Line. She read it, didn't react, kept writing. Then Burkett introduced the witness. A man named Terence Offield. Mid-40s, neat appearance, the practiced posture of someone who had rehearsed. He sat in the witness box and gave his account in the measured tones of someone who had been coached to sound reluctant. Burkett walked him through it. The story was thin but functional. Parking lot. An afternoon 6 months ago. Kalen allegedly shouting at his children in a way that drew attention. Kalen hadn't been in that parking lot. He had a grocery receipt from the same afternoon, time-stamped, from a store 20 minutes in the opposite direction. He slid that information to Marcel Line. She didn't look surprised. She had it already. Cross-examination was brief. For questions. The fourth question asked Terence Offield to describe Kalen's physical appearance. Offield answered. Height, hair color, general build. The description was wrong. Not close wrong. Wrong. The kind of wrong that meant he'd been given a description rather than a memory. Marcel Line let that sit for 3 full seconds before moving on. Judge Osei made 2 more notes. Then the right stack came out. Marcel Line introduced a financial forensics report. Third-party, certified, prepared by a firm that operated exclusively with federal-grade documentation. The report covered 18 months of transaction records across 4 shell companies linked to the petitioner. Burkett was on his feet immediately. Objection, relevance. The petitioner, Marcel Line said evenly, has requested expanded custodial access for 2 minor children. The financial stability and legal standing of the petitioner's household environment is directly relevant to the children's welfare. Additionally, she turned a page. One of these transactions occurred 3 weeks ago and involved the transfer of funds to a shell entity currently under federal review. The courtroom went quiet. Not dramatic movie quiet. Real quiet. The kind that comes when something enters a room that wasn't supposed to be there. Burkett turned to Ridian. Ridian's face was doing something it almost never did. Losing composure. Not obviously. Not loudly. But Kalen had spent 6 years reading that face in high resolution, and he saw it. The slight shift around the jaw, the eyes going a half-degree sharper, the hands that moved to the table and settled flat in the specific way Ridian's hands settled when he was suppressing the urge to stand up. Judge Osei held up one hand toward Burkett. I'll hear the exhibit, she said. Burkett sat down slowly. Marcel Line introduced 14 pages. Exhibit by exhibit. Clean. Methodical. The kind of presentation that had clearly been constructed by people who understood that in a courtroom, timing was architecture. You didn't drop everything at once. You built it piece by piece until the picture was complete, and by the time the last piece landed, the other side had no angle left to approach from. Ridian leaned to Burkett. Something was exchanged in a low voice. Burkett stood again. He asked for a recess. Judge Osei looked at the clock. Looked at the exhibit on her bench. Looked at Ridian's table with the particular expression of a judge who had seen people ask for time when they'd run out of moves. We'll take 15 minutes, she said. The gavel came down, and in the 15 seconds before the room reorganized itself into small clustered conversations and the sound of chairs scraping tile, Ridian looked at Kalen. For the first time all morning, his expression wasn't rage. Rage would have been easier to look at. It was the expression of a man who has just understood that the game he thought he was playing had been changed without his knowledge. Replaced by a different game. One where he didn't know all the rules. One where the people across the table had been playing longer. And Kalen, sitting straight in that chair, hands folded on the table in front of him, a grocery receipt and a financial forensics report and 18 months of documented survival behind him, held that gaze and did not look away. Not once. The recess clock started. Somewhere outside, in a black car parked on 2nd Avenue, Kadrix's phone was showing the same timestamp. Waiting. The recess lasted 22 minutes. Not 15. The extra 7 minutes meant something was happening in whatever hallway or conference room Burkett had pulled Ridian into. A recalculation, a new angle, a conversation that was not going the way Ridian had planned. When they returned, Burkett's posture had changed. Not dramatically, but the silver-haired ease was gone. He sat down like a man carrying weight he hadn't entered the building with. Ridian sat beside him and looked at the table. Judge Osei returned. Everyone stood, sat. The judge held up the financial forensics report. "Mr. Burkett," she said, "before we continue with testimony, I want to address the documentation introduced in Exhibit 7. Burkett stood. "Your Honor, my client disputes the characterization." "I'm not asking for a characterization," Judge Osei said. "I'm asking a direct question. Is the petitioner currently the subject of any federal financial review?" A silence. 1 beat. 2. "Ongoing review processes are not." "Mr. Burkett." The name alone was a full stop. Burkett looked at his client. Ridian said something without sound, lips barely moving. A direction, an instruction. Burkett turned back. "We cannot confirm or deny the status of any federal." "That's sufficient," the judge said. She set the report down, made a note that took 11 seconds to write, long enough that the entire room felt it. Then she looked up. "The court has concerns," she said, "about the timing and construction of this modification request. Specifically, the filing date, the credibility of the sole witness." She glanced at the cross-examination notes. "And the financial documentation now entered into the record." Burkett started to respond. She held up one finger. He stopped. "The petitioner's request for expanded unsupervised custody is denied." Ridian's hands pressed flat against the table. "Furthermore," Judge Osei continued, "given the questions raised about the petitioner's current financial and legal standing, I am ordering a 60-day review of the existing visitation arrangement pending a supplemental hearing. At that hearing, the petitioner will be required to provide full financial disclosure." The gavel. Clean. Once. That was it. No speech. No declaration. No extended moment where the room absorbed the weight of what had just happened. Just a judge who had made a decision based on evidence and moved on to the next item on her docket. Marceline gathered her files with the precise efficiency of a woman who had just done her job well and didn't need acknowledgement for it. Kalen sat very still. He was waiting for the feeling. He wasn't sure what feeling, relief, maybe, or triumph, or that particular exhausted release that comes after a long time bracing for impact. He'd expected something large. Something proportionate to how hard the last 8 months had been. What arrived was quiet. Just quiet, like a room after a long noise stops, when you didn't notice how constant the noise was until the absence of it registers. The bailiff opened the side door. Ridian stood. He buttoned his jacket with deliberate control, the practiced motion of a man refusing to let his body show what his face was working hard to contain. He turned. He walked toward the exit without looking at anyone. But he stopped at the bar. 1 step past the gate, turned back, looked at Kalen, and said, quietly, without drama, without raising his voice, "This isn't finished. Not a threat. A statement. The kind a person makes when they still believe it." Marceline put a hand briefly on Kalen's shoulder. Not comfort, just acknowledgement, and kept packing. Kalen watched Ridian leave. He didn't answer, not because he was afraid, because he had learned that some people need your words to stay alive. They need the reaction, the engagement, the proof that they still exist in your world as something real and threatening. And the most powerful thing you can do, the thing that costs them the most, is look at them like they're weather. Something that happened. Something that passed. Outside the courtroom building, the Seattle sky was doing that particular thing it does in early spring. Low cloud, specific light, the kind of afternoon that is neither warm nor cold but just real. Present. Viral was at the bottom of the courthouse steps. Therian was beside him. holding 2 cups of coffee with the slightly sheepish expression of a man who hadn't been sure what to bring but had decided action was better than nothing. Kalen walked down the steps. Therian held out a cup. Kalen took it. Didn't say thank you immediately, just held it. The warmth went through his hands and up his arms, and somewhere in his chest the quiet deepened a little further. Not healed, not resolved, not finished, but different from what it had been 3 weeks ago when he'd been standing in a grocery aisle with someone's hand around his throat and no one moving. Different from that. Viral looked at him. "How are you?" "I don't know yet," Kalen said. Viral nodded once. That was the right answer, and they both knew it. The car was at the curb. Kadrix stepped out. He looked at Kalen across the roof of the car, over the door, in the specific way that required no explanation. A look that asked a question and answered it in the same motion. Kalen nodded. Kadrix walked around the car. He stopped in front of Kalen. Not crowding, not close enough to overwhelm, just present. Face to face. City sounds around them. Coffee still warm in Kalen's hands. The press had not arrived yet. There was maybe another 5 minutes before that changed. Kadrix was aware of that window. He used it. "It's not over," he said, not to reassure. "To be honest. The federal peace is moving. There will be noise before it's quiet." "I know," Kalen said. "He'll try other angles. I know that too. And the compatibility, what we told you." "I know," Kalen said again, quieter this time. Kadrix looked at him. "You're ours now," he said. Low. Not for the press, not for the steps, not for any audience. Just for Kalen. Real power rarely needs to scream. It doesn't need a stage. It doesn't need volume. It doesn't need the other person to be diminished so that it can look bigger by comparison. It just says the thing it means directly to the one person it means it for. Kalen looked at him for a long moment. A camera clicked somewhere in the distance. A journalist. Too far to hear what was being said. Close enough to see the image. Kadrix pulled Kalen close. One arm, deliberate, not possessive in the way that crowds, but protective in the way that covers. And for the first time in a long time, Kalen didn't flinch. He stood inside that arm and looked at the city, and let himself be seen. The rooftop was quiet at 7 in the evening. 40 floors up, the city sounds compressed into something almost musical. Distant traffic, water. The low structural hum of a building that sighs working to hold itself together. The sun was still above the Olympics to the west, orange-edged and slow, the kind of light that made everything it touched look like a decision. Kalen stood at the railing. His sons were inside with their dinner. He could hear Aaron arguing about something. His voice carrying through the glass door with the particular conviction of a 5-year-old who believed very strongly that he was right. Solon's quieter counter-argument followed. Some things don't change. That was a good thing. The door behind him opened. Then 3 pairs of footsteps, different rhythms recognizable now, the way sounds become recognizable when you've stopped bracing against them. Kadrix stopped to his left. Therian to his right. Viral slightly behind, which was always where he positioned himself, the wider angle, the broader view. None of them said anything for a moment. The city moved below without knowing they were watching. "He's going to fight the financial disclosure," Kalen said. "Yes," Kadrix said. "His attorneys will delay it. For about 6 weeks," Viral said. "Then it stops being something they can delay." Kalen nodded. "And the federal review?" "Moving," Therian said. "Slowly, but consistently. So this is the part where we wait." "This is the part where you live," Kadrix said. Not correcting, clarifying. "The waiting happens in the background. Your life happens in the front." Kalen looked at his hands on the railing. He'd been gripping things for so long. Cart handles, door frames, the edges of beds in rooms he didn't know. The small fingers of his children when the world required him to be certain even when he wasn't. "You said you'd been looking," Kalen said, "for a compatible Omega." For a long time. Years, Therian said. And you believed I was it. From a grocery store. In 20 minutes. In about 40 seconds, Kadrix said. But yes. Kalen turned and looked at them. All three. Together. The way they stood, three men with the same face, different weight, different presence, had stopped being strange about 48 hours ago. And he wasn't sure when the shift had happened, only that it had. The way Therian carried warmth without using it as a tool. The way Viril's silence was a form of attention. The way Kadrix's control was underneath a form of care. Different shapes. Same thing. I'm not there yet, Kalen said. Meaning, I don't belong to you yet. I'm not ready. I'm not whole. I'm still the person who learned how to shrink, and the unlearning takes longer than the learning did. We know, Viril said. We're not asking for yet, Therian added. We're asking for direction. Kalen looked at him. Meaning what? Meaning you don't have to decide anything tonight, Kadrix said. You don't have to decide anything this week. You don't have to have language for any of this. You just have to be here. Kalen turned back to the city. The sun was lower now, the light going amber deep, the kind of evening that Seattle produces maybe a dozen times a year when everything lines up and the water and the hills and the sky decide to cooperate. I wanted a yard, Kalen said quietly. Grass. Something the boys could run across without shoes. There's a property in Madrona, Therian said immediately. Therian, Kadrix said. It has a yard, Therian said without apology. I'm just noting that it has a yard. The yard exists independent of any larger conversation. Kalen made a sound. It was small, surprised. A laugh, not quite, not full, but the unmistakable architecture of one, the way a laugh sounds in a person who hasn't used the muscle in a while and discovers it still works. Viril looked at Kadrix. Kadrix looked at Therian. Something passed between the three of them, quick, private, the wordless shorthand of people who have shared every year of their lives. And for a moment they were not the West Coast kings of anything. They were three brothers, who had looked for someone for a long time, and found him in a grocery store, holding two children and choosing silence because silence had been the only available protection. The glass door slid open behind them. Solon stepped out, still in his socks, indoor socks on a rooftop which Kalen noted and decided not to address tonight. The boy walked to his father, tucked himself against Kalen's side without explanation, and looked out at the city. Then he looked up at Kadrix. Are you staying? Solon asked. Kadrix looked down at the boy, then at Kalen. Kalen met his eyes and didn't say yes and didn't say no and didn't look away. Kadrix crouched down. I level with Solon. That's up to your dad, he said. Solon looked at his father. Kalen looked at the city, at the light going copper over the water, at the skyline that had been there every morning since he'd moved to this city with nothing but two children and a custody agreement and the specific stubborn belief that surviving was enough, until surviving wasn't enough anymore and something had to be more than just making it through the day. He thought about the grocery aisle. He thought about Rydian's hand on his throat. He thought about the footsteps at the end of that aisle that had kept walking forward. He thought about Solon's voice, small and clear and completely certain, please help my papa. And he thought about the fact that three men who had no reason to stop had stopped, who had no reason to stay had stayed, who had no reason to look for him had been looking. He exhaled, let Kadrix's words settle, you are ours now, and let himself feel what it actually felt like to be claimed by something that didn't feel like a cage. I thought escaping my past would mean surviving alone, Kalen said, quietly, to no one. To the city, to himself. The last of the light caught the water. I never imagined destiny would arrive as three kings. Solon tugged his sleeve. Dad. Yeah. Aaron ate my fries. Kadrix stood up straight. Therian was already moving toward the door. Viril's mouth pressed together in something that was absolutely a suppressed smile. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, Kalen Miro walked back into a lit room, with his son's hand in his, and did not look over his shoulder. If this story moved you, if you saw yourself or someone you love in any part of Kalen's journey, drop a comment below. Your words matter here. This channel exists for stories that remind us that strength doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and that sometimes the people who find us are the ones we never saw coming. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story on this channel. Every week there is something new. Stories that challenge you, move you, and remind you that you are not as alone as you think. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it, and come back. There is always more.